Welcome and thank you for joining the Manifest team for the cost of not knowing what the data says about software supply chain exposure. I'm your host and moderator, Alexa Raza. Today, Daniel Bardenstein is joined by Manifest Strategic Advisor, Dr. Allan Friedman, one of the foremost voices in software transparency policy in the country. In a world where software supply chain attacks are making headlines every week and the barriers to exploitation keep getting lower, most teams believe that they have a handle on what's in the software and AI that they build and buy. However, the data tells a different story. Critical details are missing across dependencies, build systems, contributors, and AI components. And when a CVE drops, an audit hits, or customer demands proof, teams are forced into a costly scramble to reconstruct what they actually shipped or bought. That scramble has a name: the transparency tax. Today, we're going to show you exactly where your organization is paying it and what becomes possible when you stop. We'll walk you through what a manual investigation actually looks like in practice, the practitioner reality of chasing down layered dependencies, why that process consistently breaks down, and why it leaves organizations exposed longer than anyone realizes. We'll extend that lens to AI, where visibility gaps are frankly worse, and then Allan is going to share what global policies are now expecting of organizations. By the end of this session, you'll walk away with 4 key things: a clear definition of the transparency tax and where it shows up in your organization, a real-world picture of how dependency compromises propagate and how to get ahead of them, a framework for connecting visibility gaps into business outcomes that your leadership actually cares about, and a concrete view of what reducing the transparency tax actually looks like. Before we get started, Daniel, Allan, can you please introduce yourselves for our audience?
Sure. Dr. Friedman, would you like to go first?
Hi, I'm Allan, and SBOM might have been my fault. Very much not my idea, but over the last 10 years in the US federal government, we helped build a community to better define what software transparency looks like and how to create it in practice, and then ultimately how to actually push it into different types of regulation. And since then, been working to help organizations around the world to understand what supply chain transparency looks like and what the future is going to look like.
Amazing. And I am Daniel Bardenstein, CEO and co-founder of Manifest, here in part thanks to Allan's fault for making SBOMs such a thing. My background in brief, I spent most of my career building enterprise security tools, allegedly applying ML to cybersecurity data a decade ago, and the third wave of AI being hot, or I guess back then it was still ML. Then spent time in US government where I led several large-scale cybersecurity programs and initiatives, including co-leading cybersecurity for Operation Warp Speed, the US efforts around the COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics, and then served as Chief of Technology Strategy and Delivery at CISA, where I got to work alongside the one and only Dr. Allan Friedman. Very excited to be here. Allan, very excited for you to join. And Alexa, thanks for hosting and moderating us.
Of course.
So with that, let's dive in. So let's start with the problem, as is always a great place to start. And unfortunately, this is a familiar one that I always think about as a bit of a bingo card. If we want to go to the net, there we go. Software supply chain attacks are not new. And as a CEO of a company that operates in this space, we like to talk about Log4j and Log4Shell, XeUtils, even the NPM attacks from this even now last summer and fall. I usually have Stuxnet or SolarWinds on my bingo card as well. This is all tried and true lore of supply chain attacks. But the reality is that organizations still don't have a handle on this. We like to joke that if Log5Shell happened today, most organizations would barely be better off in responding to it than they were now. It's been over 5 years, Allan, which is crazy.
It's true, and most of you who lived through that remember it was during the holidays. I joke that we commemorate the anniversary by finding the smallest travel laptop you have and sitting in a relative's guest bedroom, frantically trying to get some work done. But one of the things that people didn't quite catch at the time is there were a handful of organizations that actually had meaningful data in place. And even for organizations that didn't have perfect, JSON, if they had records and had the ability to track things, it was a morning's worth of grep rather than weeks of frantically being on the phone with their suppliers or getting engineers around the world to figure out what was going on. The XZ thing is also quite interesting, not because it was a terrifying attack and a realization of how determined supply chain adversaries are, but also really unpack the idea of, oh, it mattered a great deal which version of a piece of software you were using. And getting that transparency of how something entered your supply chain is the difference between panicking and being able to say, yeah, we're clear, and being able to report that up to your boss.
Absolutely. And I know we'll talk about inventory a little bit later on, but as someone, I was at the Pentagon when Log4Shell hit, and part of why we built Manifest and the functionality that was there in version -1, as it were, was just a single tool where I could type in log4j and see all the versions running in my environment. Like you said, it all boils down to inventory, right? Just knowing what you have. It's that old adage of you can't protect what you don't know about or what you don't see. But as we'll talk about next, going on to the next slide, software supply chain attacks aren't going away anytime soon. They were already on the rise in the last year or two, especially as various nation-state actors. It makes sense from the adversary economics, right? Rather than trying to breach 1,000 different companies, I can just try to exploit one specific open source library that thousands, hundreds of thousands of users or organizations are using. The economics make sense. And then, of course, we just sprinkle a little bit of AI on top of everything, and now it gets infinitely worse. And so
I've been using it as almost a bit of good news, if you want to put a silver lining on it, which is maybe, just maybe, we've gotten slightly better at defending ourselves on sort of the front door. And so attackers have naturally turned to the supply chain, which isn't nearly as well protected, is a lot more diffuse. And, until recently, we had a lot less situational awareness about both what was out there, how it was being treated, where it was coming from, and then how we as organizations were using it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even just bringing up some of these headlines on the slide here, I think we were at RSA when a lot of the Team PCP activity dropped, right? This coordinated, automated, AI-driven campaign to compromise open source repositories and actions, many of whom are used somewhere in organization's CI/CD pipeline. Often many are dependencies. I think about Trivia a lot as someone who works in the software supply chain security space, and how many commercial security tools just wrap Trivia and other open source security tooling. And so if I'm a Fortune 500 customer and I'm paying some vendor hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, how do I know that I'm not now effective because there's Trivia or Trivia action running behind the scenes here? Talking to our customers and others in the space, this just set off a crazy amount of fire alarms as the scope of this campaign increased. And talking to security practitioners, if we talk about Log4j ruining people's Christmases, I don't know if this really ruined people's RSAs because, maybe just an excuse to not have to attend, but it was just one after the other. It was Trivia action, it was check marks, it was light LLM, and then on to Axios, of course, one of the most commonly attacks.
At RSA, usually it's the vendors that are desperate to try to get into press. So it was kind of funny that the attackers got a little jealous. And also, that's how you know you've arrived as a primary attack vector, is if the North Koreans are starting to use it, because it means there's real value at risk.
Yep. And now I'm going to introduce what's going to become part of supply chain security bingo language starting from this week on, which is anthropic mythos. We have to name that really quick. If we thought this was bad, now we're staring down the introduction of a model that is powerful enough, allegedly. We'll wait till it actually hits the streets, that it has uncovered and autonomously exploited vulnerabilities in open source software that we thought was highly secure, like OpenBSD, things that have been around for decades that we haven't found exploits in every major operating system and browser. The reality is that software supply chain and open source attacks aren't going away anytime soon. If anything, they're going to rapidly accelerate in the foreseeable future. And so now is the time for defenders, practitioners, security leaders to, we have a little bit of time to think about how to orient our teams around the tsunami of bugs that we expect to come. So with that, maybe let's talk about the status quo and how organizations currently do vulnerability exposure investigations, which, as we continue to see every day depressingly, is not the most effective or automated way to do that.
Doing things manually is always the right path forward, Daniel.
Absolutely. So let's just tell the story of what we see regularly, right? So a new, think a CVE, or let's just not even be too specific to a CVE, a new vulnerability or attack is announced. And even on Team PCP attacks, I found out on LinkedIn, which is also not a great automated way to find out and push data internally into your pipeline, right? I don't think security teams are going to start piping in LinkedIn feeds into their vulnerability management tools or SIMs. But that's how ODAs and new attacks are getting dropped these days. So somehow some new incident comes to light. Usually they're in either, it's a lot of text. It's a LinkedIn post, or it's a long advisory, or someone's typed it up on their Medium blog, even before it gets to CV. Even the GHSAs on GitHub. There's a lot of reading. You have to find, well, what is affected, what versions, are there any special configurations? Oh, this only affects when this library is run on Windows or whatnot. Then I need to go pivot to figure out, well, where am I running this thing? And it's not just across the stuff I've built on the internal applications, but also the stuff I've bought, my vendor software, and that can diverge against two different teams, right? Kind of AppSec, ProdSec IR versus enterprise security and TPRM, and down into infrastructure components. And so we see a lot of people frantically copying and pasting product names and versions into their ASM tools or their inventory tools. And usually it's across a couple of different tools to figure out, am I even running this thing? Or maybe I think I have this product, but do I have the affected version? Oh, but does it have the right configuration? And all this is just kind of a recursive tree of manual triage across different tools until I compile some big Excel spreadsheet that I have to send up the chain of, here's where I think we're exposed. Now I need to go tell people to manually dive in and assess triage. Then we need to figure everything out, put out our CISO blog post. If we're mature, maybe we'll start generating VEX documents and share them downstream and start figuring out our patch cadence. It's mind-blowing that, it's mind-blowing that this is still the same after 15 or 20 years of quote-unquote modern vulnerability management.
There used to be a t-shirt people rolled around that was Brian Krebs is my IDS, but I like the idea that, now LinkedIn and Medium are my IDS. As these announcements, right, they're often a little self-serving, right? Far be it from me to say anything negative about a security vendor while chatting with Daniel, but right, there's a reason why people talk about these things. And actually doing sense making doesn't work nearly as well if we don't have some defined ways of talking about it that gives you the context of how something matters across all these systems. And again, all these systems belong to different teams. Daniel briefly talked about, third-party risk management. That's a huge part of this because now you may not just need to worry about your own organization, but all the vendors that you're working with, what's their process like? Well, if you're mature enough to have a TPRM process, your vendors probably don't unless they're the very large ones that you wouldn't worry about anyway. So you'll need to understand how they'll do it, how long it'll take, and how to integrate any finding they have back into these lovely little spreadsheets.
Yeah, it still pains me to see security professionals have to go read web pages to understand vulnerability impact, right? Again, we got to give kudos to where it's due. These large software companies publishing security advisories that are highly detailed, like Microsoft's, but it's still all text. And so I've got to read a lot of text, and I've got to do a lot of copy and paste to figure out what products, what versions, and then figure out what software internally is tracking all my Microsoft or all my Cisco or all my whatever it is.
I won't call out the major vendor in question, but one of them actually manages to store their advisories in such a way that ChatGPT can't actually directly access them. I had to download them to feed them in.
Yeah. And again, we talked about adversaries already leveraging more automation than defenders can, and then again sprinkle the AI on top of it. This is not sustainable long term, right, Alan? If adversaries are using autonomous agents or Mythos or whatever to rapidly identify vulns, exploit them, and then start moving laterally and moving down the kill chain, this isn't going to cut it for organizations, right? This is just sitting duck time, as it were.
I've been saying since, 2018, 2017, when we first started this SBOM journey, if you're not building something for automation in insert year, you're doing it wrong. That's especially true post-agentic revolution.
Yes. We'll see how long this agentic revolution lasts. It feels like we're either in the very middle or at the very beginning of it. All right, so we've talked and opined enough about the problem, and like we've alluded to, it's been going on for a long time, and we haven't seen as quick of change as we'd like. So maybe let's dive into that next. Why does the problem keep surfacing? And I think this ultimately comes down to a combination of information asymmetry and maybe a false sense of security, pun intended, of course, if we go on to the next slide. Partially this comes from tools. We have, and security leaders and AppSec teams have tools that they pay lots of money for. They vomit out way too many vulnerabilities that most organizations, can barely get to 10% of the disclosed vulns. We all are used to that nice, I don't know about nice, but those stop light, dashboards of green, yellow, red on what's critical or not, or you can ignore. And that's supposed to give us a sense of our risk. Or there's some big, long table of our inventory somewhere. So we think we have a sense of what we have. We think we have an inventory. We can search a vulnerability and maybe see the proposed fix. But that ends up not being the entirety of the story. And if we kind of look beneath the surface, the reality is a lot more complicated, right? And I think of a couple Fortune 500 organizations that we talk with and work with where, maybe the above works when you're a small company, but when you've got a central AppSec or product security team with disparate, large, special snowflake of business units, there's fragmented data sources, you're not getting full results from your security scanning tools, or maybe you're getting a high noise to signal ratio. And even if you have the inventory, somewhere in our environment we're affected by this vuln, we're often missing context. Like, where is it deployed? It's one thing if I'm a healthcare organization, it's one thing if this vulnerability is in a piece of software firmware in an MRI machine in an offsite clinic versus in an emergency room in a very busy hospital, right? So actually understanding the context of what, where, how, what other third-party software is there. And then again, that triage process is still highly manual to figure out, is this thing reachable? Is it exploitable? And that leads us with this incomplete supply chain visibility. And again, a lot of this work, like we saw after Log4Shell and all the other supply chain incidents since, it's usually throwaway work, unless we have things fully automated.
And I think that's a big part of it, which is it's one thing to say, I have the tool that does the fun thing, but the plumbing and the actual data management to make sure that the right data is in the right place to do sense making is one of these key gaps that we often skimp on or don't really think about until it's time to execute the mission. Right? The colored dashboards remind me of a famous quote by one of the sort of vulnerability data pioneers, Jay Jacobs, who would say when he was describing, how you get your colored dashboards from all these different colored data, is like, well, it's very simple. It's peanut butter times a pony equals shiny. And right, it's just one of these things that, okay, I get a dashboard, and that's good for, very quickly glancing at something, tell my boss, but it doesn't give you that readiness to actually make a decision when you need to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this topic always reminds me of something I heard from the VP of product security for a major industrials company that, sells software to, it's in the US government, it's in every building and installation we all use in our homes, without naming names. And, they spend 7 figures a year on SCA tools and SAST and DAST. And, when we were having conversations early on, he said, it would be great. I would love to be able to see what are the top 10 riskiest open source libraries across everything we have built and deployed? And what products do we sell that those things are living in? And it was mind-blowing to me how simple of a question that sounds, and a question that needs to be answered by a risk leader, and how despite security teams paying 7 figures across multiple different tool suites for this, is still incomplete. It really boggles the mind, and also of course shows gaps in the market that need to be effectively closed, and how security leaders should be thinking about things.
Yep. By the way, we faced this question at CISA of what's the most important open source that the government is uniquely exposed to, or even more important, that certain sectors are, right? So water sector is probably the scariest for those of you who looked about critical infrastructure, just in terms of how distributed it is, how vulnerable it is, and we just simply have no idea of knowing where that exposure is. But there's good news, Daniel, right? Because isn't AI going to make this easier?
Yeah, of course. Let's Salt Bay a little bit of AI on top of this. Everyone's racing to adopt AI. I don't know if anyone heard about that. I've heard of major companies whose CEOs are saying 40% of all new third-party tech has to have AI, or we're going to build 100 agents in 100 days, or 95% of all future code will be written with Claude. All of those are real stories. So this must be making things better. But what do we actually see in practice? Adoption starts with developers who are eager and excited by the shiny new technology, and I guess I'm one of these people, right? I was an early adopter of some of these AI generating vibe coding tools, and I started downloading them and using them and writing probably very poor quality code. But no, I guess I was also operating as the CISO for Manifest, but no one at the rest of the company knew what I was doing or what was installed on my laptop, and that problem is only certainly exacerbated at major companies. And we saw this in Manifest's black box report, where we surveyed hundreds of security practitioners and leaders around the world. Almost 2/3 of organizations we surveyed knew that they had shadow AI. There's stuff that developers are installing, accessing, making calls out to third-party APIs or websites to leverage the hotness and greatness that is AI. Security team is completely unaware and none the wiser. And then if we look next to layer on top of that, most organizations, if that layer one is just, I'm going to download Cursor or Windsurf, or I'm going to just make use ChatGPT or call the APIs, we have organizations that are now starting to, fine tune and do more complex things with data, right? And there's also multiple new attack surfaces of within AI as well, right? So it could be, we think about open source risk for software. We now have open weight models and publicly available data sets, and how much we trust that. We have dependencies that are in the in our pipelines, and how much we trust those software dependencies. We're generating, there's so much software and AI that's now being intermixed here in these Python notebooks or on someone's terminal that AppSec and security tools and governance teams are completely unaware of. And I forget who said it first or loudest here, but AI is the new attack surface. There's untrusted software, there's untrusted models and data sets, and if you explode a model enough, there's just software at the end of the day. And we see increased amount of organizations that are starting to do this more mature work, like training open weight models on internal or external data and assessing the lineage and the security of those things. And people starting to build their own models, which makes sense ultimately, but again poses more risk and some other fun, scary things, which I know we'll get to in a sec. But Allan, what's your take on how AI has made all this better, or perhaps not?
Right. The one thing that we do know is that the more, as we shift, especially to an agentic world, the more access I give my agents, the better it will work, and the more things it will be able to magically figure out what to do. So of course I'm going to give it access to local host and everything running on it. And who worries about tracking that? And by the way, the things that have helped convert me and helped me convince my friends who are skeptics in face of this is, hey, you know what? If I don't give it explicit permission, decent chance it'll figure out some ways to access some things anyway, given how open-ended my requests are going to be. You use this term shadow AI. I've always loved it. I think shadow AI it's kind of a silly term. It's shadow AI is like regular AI, but with cooler hair and music. And it doesn't surprise me that you found so much shadow AI in organizations. I'm kind of skeptical about the 1/3 that say that they don't have it.
Yeah, I think it's 63% of organizations admit that they have shadow AI, and what's the math? 27% either just don't know that they have it yet. So let's dive in. This seems to be the new marketing buzzword here, but I do think it is an accurate statement. So when I think about shadow AI, I mean, first of all, this is language borrowed from, shadow IT, right? We think about this is reminiscent from the rapid revolution of the cloud, right? And we can spin up cloud instances, and I can host my code on someone else's machine, as the joke goes, right? And IT folks and developers were spinning up all sorts of cloud infrastructure, cloud-based apps that central security had no idea about. We're already seeing the same thing for AI. And I know a couple of stories that we've seen from the wild, which are pretty concerning, and it's hard not to imagine that these aren't very prevalent. We've got a great first example around a large IT company that has basically no DeepSeek or no China in my AI policy. But DeepSeek is fast and cheap and accurate, and there was a developer that really wanted to use DeepSeek for some prototype that he had built. So what did he do? He downloaded DeepSeek, he slightly tuned it, just ever so slightly fine-tuned it, so it's still pretty much the same thing, and then tried to pawn it off as his own model, right? Oh, this is Daniel's model. I found this thing online on
It's really
Hugging.
nice of you to train a very large model.
I know. And so, hey, compliance team, I whipped up this thing I found online. Like, can it go forward? How do compliance teams and regulators understand, or security teams understand, that circumventing some compliance AI is pretty easy, right? It's if you spend enough time on Hugging Face, you can see how easy it is to adapt, quantize, fine tune, etc., models. Lots of crazy stories around, just lack of visibility on inventory. It's gotten so bad that some organizations we've talked to just ban or block Hugging Face because it's so easy for a developer to just, in their terminal or code, write, Hugging Face client.import or whatever it is, download model, name of model, and now it's basically running in my code. And unless you have like a really strong proxy service there, again, blind spot for security teams. And, that can make it all the way into production, right? Maybe something I'm just working on in test in my IDE. I click open pull request, and whether it's malicious intent or whether it's benign and I just accidentally push this thing to production, who knows about that? And I was going to mention some other scary stories around incident response in AI, but Allan, please jump in here.
I think some of the fun things that I've seen are really around in the regulated spaces, where there are just sort of very clear top-down rules that are easy to enforce with standard coding tools. It took us a while to get there, right? For a while it was just, hey, you can do it again. There are tools that are out there, but without the ability to track it, guardrails, we know, are ever evolving because the tools are ever evolving. And so having a very explicit inventory is the first step before you can even have anything like the vetting or anything like the compliance policies enforceable in place.
Absolutely. I'm full of stories, but I'm going to save mine for once we can actually talk about, well, how does this impact organizations? And you sort of hit on it just now, Allan, this lack of transparency. We're starting to think about things here in terms of a tax, right? Nobody likes a tax. It's something that you have to pay that you don't always know you're going to upfront. And so we've been thinking a lot about this hidden tax on AI as a transparency tax. So maybe let's talk about what we mean by this term as a transparency tax. So we think of this as the extra time, cost, and risk organizations spend to understand the software and AI they use when transparency isn't provided by suppliers or readily available within the development lifecycle. What does that mean? We think something is free. It's on Hugging Face. We think this third-party AI-enabled DevOps tool is a good deal because it's really cheap and speeds up our cycles, but we end up paying for it later on when there's compliance and we can't answer the mail on what we're using, when there's an incident we don't know what we have, or we need to spend that time figuring that stuff out and digging into it. As a former policy person and government professional, Allan, how does a transparency tax sound to you? Do you think that accurately describes what organizations are facing here?
I love this term because even though I sort of self-identify as an engineer, my PhD is actually in applied economics. So anytime we're talking about this sort of thing, it warms my dismal science heart. The history of the economics of security is built around an understanding of asymmetric information and a misunderstanding or a lack of visibility into our investments and the payoffs. And so this idea of a tax is very powerful because there is a cost to it. We just assume it's the natural cost of, oh no, something bad happened. Well, I can budget it in that domain. And it resonates also with the behavioral economics side of things, or the psychological side, where we sort of discount certain behaviors. Or, oh no, investing in an IT project now, who has the time? I can't point to the line item. When there's all kinds of risks that we know we have to plan for, know we have to budget for, and we aren't able to sort of show that investing in this now will save money in the long run, both in terms of prevention and mitigation of the impact down the road. So it's a very powerful term.
Yeah, it always reminds me, our space in SBOM and software supply chain security is full of analogies, of course. This to me is like the tax, the cost you would take on if you bought a house without ever doing a home inspection, right? If you don't actually go in the basement and find the black mold before you buy the house and say, the seller's they're going to take care of that and pay for it before we move in, you're going to spend the time and dollars fixing that. I've heard stories of people who bought a house where that happened and it was just under a carpet that was very intentionally placed. And then they lift up the carpet when they buy the house and, okay, there goes a couple $1,000s and a couple of weeks of work. So now we're just thinking about this at tech scale for major organizations. So, we're talking a lot about this tax of transparency, but what do we think the impact is when organizations actually have it? And, maybe we can quantify it a little bit. This is why we put out this black box inside the black box report. I don't think there's anything here that would necessarily surprise us. Maybe this last metric here. So, we obviously know and expect that organizations, 64% of whom, can adopt new technology faster, which especially in AI, if we have it from some major organizations we talk with, it can take them 6 to 8 weeks just to approve the use of a new model to make sure it's compliant and secure. 2 months is a long time in AI land when your competitors might be adopting stuff faster or building and moving faster. Almost the same number have faster resolution of security issues. That the same supply chain attack, NPM, Team PCP, etc. story. Where, to your point, Allan, if you know what you have and you have everything connected, it becomes a very simple query. And this one I thought was really interesting. 15% report reduced downtime, and we had to think about this one. It reminds me of an example from a large financial services institution that we work with, where when they find a vulnerability or gets reported in a third-party product, like they have protocols where they have to maybe sever the connection to that potentially mission-critical service, and people can't do their jobs or do it as effectively. So the more they can find out and mitigate this stuff earlier, the less downtime they have in terms of actually accessing, various internal or third-party tools.
So that story is really interesting. I think, and I was struck by the number. So like downtime, how does that affect it? So it totally makes sense. You also see this in your actual sales pipeline. So over the years, I've gotten to know major hospital buys a lot of medical devices, treats a lot of very high-profile people, and one thing is, at no point will the security team ever be able to tell a physician, you can't buy this thing. But what they can say is, you can buy it, but it's going to take us 6 months to build out a custom network segmentation and put everything around it. so that it integrates with our system in a way that doesn't expose the rest of our hospital to risk. 6 months, for those of you who are on the sales side of things, that's not just a meaningful distinction for a small business. Hey, that's your quarterly bonus. And so there's some ways to think about it. The other thing that struck me about this is implementation of new products and new technology. Because I think this speaks to something that we don't spend enough time thinking about, which is transparency gives you insight into your technical debt. It tells you what the underlying foundation is. So I want to shift away from this coding platform. I want to shift away from this model. Thank God we're finally get off spring, whatever. But now you actually, before you can make that shift, you need to understand what are all of the places that it's locked into different parts of your infrastructure. What are all the places that your product pipeline depends on it? If you don't have that visibility, it's going to be a lot more time intensive. That also makes it harder for internal innovators to say, I've got a great new idea, let's make it happen. You as a leader can't do that because now you have a higher cost to make it happen. So again, it's dollars and cents, but it's also, careers or, monthly sales bonuses.
Yeah. I think sales is, a group that people often forget about in this context, where if you need to provide, answer the mail on software supply chain security requirements to close a deal, sales can be very loud in a company very quickly because, they want the money to come through. But as you can guess, they're probably not the only ones that are impacted by this tax. And it almost seems like there are, half a dozen different groups within an enterprise that end up having to pay this transparency tax. You mentioned building new products and innovation, right? Developers, not being able to build the features quickly. We've had to work with developers that literally need to run or write custom scripts just to quickly identify all the dependencies and all the containers that went into the product that the customer is using and scan them for vulnerabilities and triage the vulnerabilities. It takes so much time that's not actually productive and moves helps the bottom line. I think security analysts probably pay some of the heaviest tax, right? Responding to these supply chain incidents, trying to figure out, where all the Axios is it in my third-party tech, this critical thing that we use? Procurement, right? We're the ones digging through SOC 2 Type 2 reports and long vendor risk questionnaires, and having to rapidly figure out where they might be exposed through, third-party, tools and teams. And then IR, for whether it's part of security analysts or it's, kind of the broader enterprise security team, something goes wrong, having to find out where it is, it just takes that much more time, as we've talked about, when data is disparate and we don't know what's in the stuff we've built and bought. And I think the impact, as we've listed here, is we've already hit on and understood quite well.
So on the analyst side of things, part of what makes it so hard is really what you're trying to do is prove the negative. Right? You want to be able to say, we're okay. And answering that question wrong is one of those not great for your career moments. So you really need to have meaningful data, complete data, and accessible data to do this. The other approach, just in terms going back to the sales side of things, because that's where the money comes from, it's kind of interesting to see the evolution. Where I've heard, when we first started this SBOM side of things, back in the day, one of the first sectors to actually promote this was the Edison Energy Institute, which is a trade association of all of the large energy companies who delivered power to Americans. And they said, hey, you should require an SBOM. And so this went out into all the contracts. And I would hear a bunch of people, first thing you do is just draw a big red line through that contract. Sorry, we won't do it. We're still going to buy the stuff from you. Things have changed a lot since then, and now I'm hearing that people will even say, give me an SBOM, and someone will do a sniff test and say, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's not your full SBOM. Schedule some time with someone inside the prod team to say, tell me how you got this. so that I can feel confident that you're really telling me what's in it, because I have a hunch that you just gave me a lock file. And that's not good enough for my environment.
Yep. There are certainly those out there who think that even when SBOMs are shared, that no one does anything with them. And that may have been true in the past, but we're certainly seeing a very rapid adoption of people actually doing things with SBOMs on the third-party risk side, especially not just at time of procurement, but doing that continuous monitoring when something hits.
And a lot of it's being driven by government.
Yeah, absolutely. Both, in terms of imposing costs, both the sweet dollars of government contracts as well as the regulations are really a looming wave that I think a lot of are really changing organizational behavior. So let's chat about that a little bit. I know that before I joined government, I was back in the private sector. I always kind of looked down upon or thought it was unnecessary, all the people who knew all the alphabet soup and acronyms, and now here I am being exactly one of those people. So, Allan, I'll defer to you here. You've got longer government experience, and we're Mr. SBOM globally. Let's talk through some of these regulations that literally can impose costs on companies literally now worldwide around actually knowing what's in their software.
So it really is incredibly unlikely that an organization of even medium size is not going to be affected by some aspect of a requirement for transparency in their supply chain. Medical devices are perhaps the most famous. We're hearing rumblings that, right, hey, medical devices are just one part of the medical ecosystem. There's been a lot of discussion over the past few years of, is that going to spill over into other aspects of health? There is, for the automotive sector, you will no longer be able to sell a car in the United States in a few short years if you can't provide a complete accounting of where things in your car came from, to be able to show that it didn't come from certain countries. We're seeing encouragement in a couple of global standards. UN, the rest of the world outside the US uses ISO 21434 as a way of sort of thinking about automotive security as well. And it's also important to know that this isn't just government-specific regulations. If you touch credit card data, you are regulated by a private sector rule, the Payment Card Industry's Data Security Standard. And the latest version of that doesn't say SBOM. You search for SBOM, you won't find it. However, it does say that you have an awareness of every dependency, including open source dependencies, to be able to verify that there aren't vulnerabilities that you haven't controlled for in your system. Our friends in the government, right? One of the fun things is, things come, things go. But remember, the 14028 requirement still is nominally on the books, and the White House, even it has yanked a bunch of the requirements, including the attestation form, if you remember that type of thing, that's no longer there. But there's an explicit encouragement that says agencies should think about asking for an SBOM if it's something that's important to them. Similarly, there are all sorts of requirements now around national security. You may not care about national security, but there's a decent chance national security cares about you. Where is your software coming from? Who's using it? For me, the most famous example here is due to sanctions against Russia following their invasion of Ukraine and other national security concerns. They said, hey, listen, we're very worried about any software that came from Russia. That translated into the maintainers of the Linux kernel looking around and saying, we're sorry, but we're going to have to remove certain rights and privileges from people who've been long-standing contributors to the Linux project, just based on where they were from. So it's very important that you know what country, the term is foci, foreign ownership and controlling interests. And what that means is going to vary a little bit, but there's a lot that's out there.
Yep. It makes me think of, we talked about XEUtils, which I think was done by an actor affiliated with the Chinese government or Chinese interests, and Polyfill.io was another supply chain compromise as well that was kind of nation state oriented. I think what will be interesting, just to cap this off here, the EU obviously is much stricter with regulation than here in the US. The Cyber Resilience Act, looming, later this year to impose fines of either 15 million euros annually, or if it's 2 or 3%, Alan, of global revenue. But for a major company, that's not nothing. And so it's really starting to change organizational behavior. And we see this across, Korea, India, UK and Australia. To your point, SBOM seems to be one of the few things not only the two US political parties, but even the whole world can agree upon these days. Hey, we need to understand what's in the technology that we're building and buying, and this seems to be a good way, a good tool to help identify that. Even though, as we talked about, SBOM, it's not the end goal, it's a means to an end. It's a means towards transparency and operationalization.
One of the last things that I did while I was working for the US government was help coordinate a document, one of these very high-level, fluffy international documents, but getting 19 organizations from around the world to sign on to a document that says, of course SBOM's a good idea. Why would you not want to know what's in your supply chain?
Yep. Always appreciate the work you do, Alan. All right, let's mosey on. We got lots more to cover. So transparency can also become an operational control. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit. So let's talk about, we talked about the need for transparency and the tax it can impose when it's not there. But how do we go to monitoring this stuff continuously? So we're starting to think about transparency as an operational control. So how do we move organizations from documentation or static JSON documents into live and constantly updated and accurate inventories of software dependencies and assets? How do we go from drowning in volumes of risks and vulnerabilities into something that's prioritized by exposure, by actual risk, and by what actually matters? And ultimately, this is going to drive our decision making, right? So the transparency that organizations can attain while investing, combined, of course, with that automation, will lead ultimately to better prioritization, faster decision making, and overall better outcomes.
So as we sort of move into the post-AI world or the AI-driven world, one of the fun mantras is that everyone is a builder. And that's fantastic. But it also gets to the idea that you need something to do it. Love the famous Sherlock Holmes quote, you cannot make bricks without clay. And so if you're going to be a builder, what are you going to be building on? You're going to be building on data that is aimed to supporting automation.
And also a great way to throw in a Sherlock Holmes quote there. It's not a common one hears in security. I strongly support more Sherlock Holmes and maybe Edgar Allan Poe in security discussions. But you mentioned automation. Let's talk more about that, because obviously we're talking about the speed of AI. We're talking about how do we do this stuff effectively. Organizations need to be thinking out processes to actually gather and operationalize this data. And it all starts, as we know, with the least sexy of a cybersecurity program, asset inventory. It still boggles the mind that most organizations, either they don't have a good inventory, or it's split over several different tools, or it's wildly outdated. That to me is still mind-boggling. Like, how do you protect, how do you respond quickly to what you don't know you have and where it is? But then on top of that, like we talked about earlier, even if you have that inventory, you need to integrate with everything else you have, right? You need that automation, you need the tools to talk to each other. Otherwise, you're still just manually hopping from tool to tool. And where does this ultimately get us to is, really it's speed and accountability, right? We need to understand when risks are identified and where they are identified, how we assess them, and what actions were taken. Like, we need full chains of custody. Alan, I think you made a really good point earlier around, sometimes it's about finding the needle in the haystack in terms of risks, but sometimes it's about proving to your management or to your auditors or your customers that there was no needle in the haystack.
The famous line here in Washington, D.C., what did they know and when did they know it? And that's exactly what we need in security, which is, hey, God forbid bad thing happens to your company, your organization. There are going to be a lot of people who are going to start to ask questions, and having that data is going to be really helpful in an era when CISOs are getting sued or the government's going after them. And everyone in the security stack can play a role in making sure that we can show that we're on the right track.
Absolutely. So we spent all this time talking about all the various problems and woes and gaps in the market. What brings us together here today, obviously, is Manifest, right? The product and company that we're collectively building to address a lot of these issues, borne out by the pain points and gaps that we described and that many of us experience. So maybe let's spend a little bit of time just giving a quick overview for folks who aren't necessarily familiar with what we do and how it works and how it addresses some of these things. And I'm happy, obviously, to give the very high level, but obviously, folks can certainly reach out afterwards to actually see the product in action. So we think about the domains that we have focused in on today, right? There's that first party use case around how do I understand the dependencies and the hidden supply chain risks in the stuff that we build, right? Where SCA, SAST, and DAST typically live, handled by Manifest product security capability. That also helps people answer the mail on, Team PCP just compromised Axios. And we did this for, customer last week. Team PCP compromised Axios. Where's all the Axios in your environment? What versions are you running? Are they affected? What's the fix? Where are they deployed, etc.? Also helps answer the mail on compliance, right? So taking in all the data that people have in terms of what they build and the vulnerabilities and other sorts of risks, and putting it into something where I can quickly answer the mail on an SBOM, a VDR, a VEX, a PDF. How do we, to your point, close those deals faster, get regulators to give us the green light forward. We also talked a lot about third-party risk and procurement, right? What's the best way to reduce enterprise risk? Not bring it in the first place, especially for, we talked about OT and ICS or medical device manufacturers and hospitals. ICS and OT or IOMT, you don't just patch them or replace them. Like if you buy an MRI machine, you're going to live with that MRI machine for 20 years or 30 years. Or you may have some, ICS or OT deployed, out in the middle of the ocean on a tanker or way underneath the earth. And so understanding what's in your third-party tech before you buy it, not just your SOC 2 Type 2 reports, not the long vendor questionnaires that you have to spend time on, not your, ABCD report card on whether that your supplier trains its employees annually on security awareness. Like, what's the empirical risk of this piece of technology that we're about to buy and deploy in our environment and give access to our sensitive data? And lastly, kind of turning the AI buzzword in on itself, is how do we actually understand the supply chain risk of all the AI that we're rapidly bringing, whether it's from Claude, Anthropic or OpenAI, or whether it's from those open weight models from Hugging Face or publicly available data sets. We're just shipping this stuff in as quickly as possible. So ultimately what we're after here is how do we understand, how do we gate and assess risk on the way into the enterprise, whether it's from third-party tech we buy or open source that we bring in? How do we help monitor, build that continuously updating inventory at a moment's notice so we know exactly all the open source, where it is, what containers they're in, where it's deployed, what end products there are. And then lastly, do that continuous monitoring on top. So if something happens, we can pinpoint in a second exactly where this is. And Alan, maybe I'll tag you in a little bit. We're moving towards, obviously, cryptography and hardware to bring into this platform to get that holistic view of technology risk, not just software risk. Maybe do you want to share a little bit about some of your work and research and experience on how all this applies to hardware?
Sure. So first, you hit one core piece, which is continuous, right? This isn't a static approach. An SBOM is a snapshot because it captures software at a point in time that works really well if software is just here's your software, have fun for the next 5 years. That's not how software works, and that's not how risk works. But also this sort of movement towards transparency, knowing what you have being the foundation of modern risk management, has been expanding. You've been doing great work on SBOMs for AI and AI bombs, and by the way, if you want a useless conversation, debate the difference between those two.
Oh, I've done that too much, as you know, Alan. That's a great and a fruitless conversation.
It is. Uh, but it's sort of unpacking what else is out there. So cryptographic bill of materials is maturing. A lot of that is driven by what you're looking for. And some of it gets into quite the details, which is, there are many different functionalities. How do I figure out whether there's a fallback risk? Do I care? But really all software, especially in the AI space, is increasingly dependent on hardware infrastructure as the linchpin for trust. And it's kind of embarrassing how little we know about the provenance of our hardware. Right? You can't build a thing without a manufacturing bill of material. Here's all the pieces. But being able to say with confidence where it came from, who touched it, is it counterfeit, or for a lot of sensitive materials, is this something that is exposed to a potential very serious mature adversary trying to undermine? And even if you don't feel that you're at risk of being the victim of a nation state attack, guess what? The government may want you to know what it is, or, I don't know, may want to tax something based on where it comes from. And so we're trying to build out a new movement, similar to how we built SBOM, of a community to say, let's shape what a hardware bill of material, or HBOM, is going to look like moving forward.
Yeah, we're super excited to see the continued work you do, Alan, and obviously here to support it. And, I always already had to be very careful walking through airports on the phone talking about S-bombs. I can't wait till us talking about H-bombs, walking through TSA and seeing the really concerned looks, and hopefully won't get tackled or my bag searched. So, Alan, it's always a joy to chat, but we should probably get to what do all of the listeners here, what do they take away from our pontifications and ramblings about all things supply chain security? So let's dive in. I'll start at the high level, and Alan, you can please provide some color here. So I think, as always, and I'm always on my soapbox these days talking about this, we got to start with the basics. Basics: inventory, understand what you have, where it lives, reduce risk on the way in. Especially with AI security, there's so many companies out there that are going after the really sexy, novel threats, which are very valid. But in the same way that most of a cyber risk program isn't just going after ODAs, most of the day-to-day stuff is not going to be the sexy stuff. So we got to start with the basics. Second, focus on interoperability of your tools. We talked a lot today about automation. Having the data is great, but otherwise someone's going to have to click from browser tab to browser tab. And ultimately, do this stuff well. Avoid the transparency tax. Alan, what do you think?
So I think let's start on some of the motivation, right? What are your key stakeholders in terms of who's involved in the project before you get there? Why are you doing this, right? What is the strategy? What are you trying to prove and to whom? Is it internal? Is it customers? Is it regulators? What will they want to know? What is a crisis that you might be held accountable for? And how will transparency make it easier and cheaper for you to deliver on what that looks like and reduce some of this transparency track? And then operationally, one of the challenges that I bump into for organizations trying to do this is they say, we're all in, you've convinced us, go team SBOM. Everyone in our organization is now an SBOM advocate, an SBOM warrior. No, right? Start small. Don't try to eat the entire cliched pachyderm all at once. Focus on particular part that will work with an existing workflow, vulnerability triage, incident response, vendor risk, and map out what it's going to take to integrate SBOM data into that workflow, right? You're not just trying to generate the data, you're trying to make sure the data can be integrated into the workflow.
Absolutely. Well, I hope organizations can quickly and easily do all of this stuff. And hopefully we've, if not convinced people, show them that there is a path towards doing this easily and in a programmatic way. So with that work, let's share with everybody where they can learn a little bit more about all the stuff we've talked about. So Allan, where can people go to learn more about you and all the work you're doing?
Find me on the social medias. LinkedIn is a great way to get in touch. Mention that you saw me on this webinar. And if you want to know more about HBOM, what we're trying to build, hit up hbom.tech.
Very excited to visit it myself afterwards. And for everything Manifest related, if you want to see the platform in action and get a huge leg up on building your end-to-end software and AI supply chain security program, just go to our website and ask and request for a demo. Or as Allan said, find me on the socials where you can see me occasionally rant about various things in all things bill of materials land.
And of course, we can't forget to remind our audience that they can download their version of Beyond the Black Box, where we interviewed or surveyed 300 security professionals, and they can see some of the data that was mentioned in this webinar. With that, we are at time. So we are going to save our Q&A today, but I want to say thank you, Allan and Daniel, for taking the time to join us on this webinar, share what you know, help educate our audience and our industry on software supply chain security. And of course, thank you to our audience for joining, whether you're joining live or on demand. With that, thank you so much.
Thanks all.